Fallout shelter. Capacity 1,138. Now being stocked with food, water, medical and sanitation kits, radiological monitoring equipment. Everything needed to shelter and sustain the people who work in this building if a crisis ever comes. To them, this sign spells protection. To me, it spells just another small part of a very big job. I'm Hank Adams, the city's Civil Defense Director. And the thing I keep remembering is the need for protection doesn't stop at 5 p.m. It goes right on when these people go home, to all the houses on the quiet streets, where they spend the rest of their hours. For the fact is, today, we live in a world where danger could strike with a minimum of warning, in less time than it takes the average man to drive home at the end of the day. There's no perfect protection against nuclear attack, of course. If it ever comes, there's no telling whether our town would be hit or spared. And no way of protecting against the destruction of blast and heat. There's not much any shelter can do about that. But one thing we can do something about, and that's radioactive fallout. It could drift on the winds for tens or hundreds of miles. It could strike down a town that hadn't even been touched by direct attack. Without shelter from it, a lot of people could die needlessly. We don't aim to let that happen. We've made a good deal of progress in our community fallout shelter program, a lot more than you might suspect. The National Shelter Survey turned up more than 120 buildings here in town with enough heavy shielding already built in to meet the government standards. But of course, there's still a way to go before we reach our final goal. Protection for every man, woman, and child. Shelter always in range, wherever they might be, day or night, around the clock. We're going to need more shelter space for that, in some places where there's not quite enough of it now. And where are we going to find it? Well, some of it will come through new construction, designed with the need for fallout shelter in mind. Some of it in industrial plants, where management knows that a company's most irreplaceable asset doesn't lie in the machines, but in the experience and the skills of the men who run them. Some will come through improvements made by building owners at their own expense for the protection of their customers and tenants. We're going to have to build added shielding into many of our schools and our hospitals, too, for they play a vital role in any emergency that might come. Finally, some of the new shelter space we'll need will have to be found on quiet streets like this, where there's not a fallout shelter sign in sight. Of course, that doesn't mean there's no shelter here. Take this house, for example. Belongs to the Warren family. That's Betsy Warren and one of her boys. The house doesn't look much different from any of its neighbors. It has the usual mortgage and an unfinished attic that will have to wait. It also had an unfinished basement that couldn't. And that makes it a small but vital part of our plan. The plan of protection for everyone, where he works and where he lives. I remember when Fred and Betsy Warren first came to see me last summer. They'd been thinking about the problem of fallout protection, trying to decide just what would be best for their family. For most people, and in most places, the answer probably lies in using the nearest community shelter. But for others, a family shelter may seem the best solution, perhaps because they live too far away from the community shelter, or simply because they want the family together in time of emergency. With the Warrens, it was a little of both. This is the above-ground shelter. It's often constructed in areas where surface water or rock make it impractical to build a shelter underground. Now, these double walls are built of solid concrete blocks. They measure 4 by 8 by 16 inches. And when the shelter is finished, each wall will be at least 3 feet thick from here to here. And this space in between the walls will have to be filled up with gravel or earth. And the roof will be covered by a thick layer of gravel. What about these pipes here? Well, this one is the air intake, and this one is the air exhaust. And inside you'll have a blower to circulate fresh air. Now this one is a pre-shaped metal shelter. It's basically a shell made up of metal sections. And when the shell is finished, it's covered with not less than 3 feet of earth. That provides the mass you'd need. Now, this third one is a basement shelter. Now, while the construction of the first two probably would require the services of a contractor, you ought to be able to make this one yourselves.
Who, me? You know, I don't know the first thing about building.
Well, neither did I when I started working on mine, but you've seen it. Worked out fine. You can build this right in the corner of your basement. You already have two of the walls. Then all you have to build are these walls and the roof.
Yeah, with a little good planning and some advice, maybe I could build it myself. You know, we could put it over in the corner where the baby crib and that other stuff is.
Well, sure you could build it. Just try to clear the window. Otherwise, you'd have to fill it up.
What about this last one?
Well, this one is an underground concrete shelter. It's constructed entirely of poured concrete, reinforced with steel bars. And like the pre-shaped metal one, it would be covered with earth. You'd probably need a contractor to build this one too, Fred.
How about the cost of these?
Well, that depends. It'll vary depending on the size and the type you want. Oh, say, wait a minute. I think I still have some of the cost estimates that Margaret and I got before we built ours. They ought to give you some help. I gave them my own estimates and booklets showing various low-cost family shelter designs with the plans on how to build them. Fred chose the basement shelter type and figured out the cost of materials. It came to less than $100. The cost of labor? Well, it would have been modest enough if he'd called on a contractor. But in Fred's case, it came to exactly nothing, since he decided to build it himself, and he had two willing young helpers.
Put the pin, Chris. Okay, push hard, Bobby.
Okay, fella, just put it over there.
All set, Dad?
Just a minute, want to check my list.
Blocks, half blocks, mortar, posts, nails, bolts.
Looks like we're all set. Okay, you fellas can mix some mortar while I start in on these guidelines.
Okay, Dad. Come on, Bob. Dad said add the water slowly. Wait, not yet.
The easiest way to make a straight line is to use a chalked string. The boys used a pre-mixed mortar. All they had to do was add water and stir. After the outline of the shelter walls was drawn, Fred was ready to start laying the first blocks.
Okay, thanks. You fellas can bring in some more blocks while I start spreading this mortar.
Okay.
Don't drop them on your feet now.
Fred started at the right angle corner of the shelter walls. He spread enough mortar to ensure a good, solid joint between the floor and the blocks. He carefully set the block firmly into place. Then he checked to make sure the block was level. Adjustments were made while the mortar was still wet. Fred then spread mortar for the second block, which was set at a right angle to the first one. Before laying the block, he spread mortar on one end. This ensured that the space between the blocks would be well filled with mortar. He checked the level again and adjusted the block along both its length and width. He used a carpenter's square to make sure the two blocks formed a true right angle. Fred had extended the shelter walls along the chalk lines on the floor. The first course now was completed. Fred returned to the right angle corner to start the second course. Laid the blocks in this course so that each block covered the joint between the blocks below. The slight excess of mortar showed Fred he was using enough. Fred was following good construction techniques, and the walls were rising as planned. He'd now built the right angle corner 6 courses high.
Oh, good. You fellas keep the blocks coming. I'm going to set up this wall guideline.
Okay.
Now, Fred stretched a guideline along the outer face of the shelter wall. This helped him place the next blocks correctly.
Well, not bad for amateurs, huh?
I'll say. What about that
Hi,
corner?
Bets.
Hi.
Well, how does it look?
Looks great. Well, I think you hard-working men ought to quit now. It's getting late, and you two have school tomorrow.
Yeah, you better turn in, fellas. I'll be up in a minute.
Oh, gee, Mom, it's early yet. We got work to do.
I know, but tomorrow's another day. Now, come on. Let's go.
I'll be up soon. I just want to lay one more block.
All right.
Good night.
Night.
While Fred and the boys were busy on the construction, Betsy had been planning the food stock to be kept in the shelter. She chose food that included as many family favorites as possible. She had to stock enough food and other supplies in the shelter to last the family at least 2 weeks. To avoid staleness and spoilage and possible waste, these foods should be rotated into her regular menus every few months and replaced with fresh shelter supplies. She selected container sizes that would eliminate problems with leftovers. Fred and the boys had already spent several evenings on the shelter, and now the walls were definitely taking shape. Saturday again, and the walls were almost up. The outer walls were ready for the roof structure, but Fred let the mortar between the blocks set for a day before starting on the roof. The first step in constructing the roof was to bolt upright posts to the foundation walls. The posts were weather-treated to prevent rotting due to dampness. Fred used 7-inch bolts with expansion sleeves. Before placing the first joist, Fred used a small block of wood to keep it in place while toenailing. Fred slid the double joist over the walls at the entrance to the shelter.
Okay, Larry, go in the shelter and I'll pass this over to you.
Right. Easy now. All set.
Good. Okay, Larry, let's have that brace.
Fred placed a brace between the joists for lateral support. He toenailed the end of the joist to the wall beam. Toenailed the wooden brace to the joist to hold the joist securely on edge. The same procedure was followed with the next joist. Fred checked the joists to make sure they were all solidly nailed. Braces were also placed between the joists where they passed over the shelter wall, one on the inside, one on the outside. This formed a wooden box. Fred then filled the box with mortar to make this space sufficiently dense.
Let's have it up here.
Here it comes.
To lay the roof, Fred slipped roof boards into place and nailed them to the joists.
Oh, here, pick this one up and we'll bring it over there.
All right.
Okay?
Then he placed blocks on the roof boards. 2 courses of blocks were laid. No mortar was needed to hold them in position. Before the roof could be completed, the exposed ends of the joists had to be covered with blocks. Fred set a block on edge and moved it into place. The hollow space behind the block was then filled with mortar.
Why don't you kids wait upstairs for Mom? She'll be home in a few minutes. Have a glass of milk and rest a while. I'll finish up here.
Okay, see you later, Dad.
Right. here.
And the beds are going to be here.
Yeah, the beds are going to be there, and the shelves are going to be right along here.
Well, that'll be the best place for them.
Yeah.
Betsy stored her food supplies. The Warrens already had put in many of the things they'd need for an emergency. Enough water for 14 days, an emergency first aid kit, enough bedding, a few cooking utensils, emergency tools. Almost everything they'd need to live here if the day ever comes.
Hi. Well, looks like you've been busy.
Yep, almost finished with the food. Did you pick up the radio?
Yep, got it right here.
Fred brought down the last few important items. A portable radio and a few extra batteries. A small cooking stove. A flashlight.
Well,
Hi, Dad.
hi there.
Where are we going to put them, Mom? Where did you get all
In the
that?
closet.
All right, put them neatly under the bed, and I'll fix it later. Go on.
You look at the Warren house, and it doesn't look any different than it did before. Just an ordinary house on a quiet street. But something's been added. Something that could be important. A well-stocked family fallout shelter. A small but useful addition to our overall community shelter plan. The plan of protection for everyone. Not only where he works, but where he lives. Like all Americans, the Warrens hope the time never comes when it must be used. But if it's needed,